right now, wherever you're watching this. On a couch, at a desk, on a train. Notice your legs. Notice how wide they are. Because in about 45 minutes, without you doing anything wrong, an enzyme in those exact muscles will have already dropped its activity by more than half, and your body will have quietly started treating you like you're asleep, even though your eyes are wide open. That's not a metaphor. That's a real, measurable switch happening inside your thighs right now. This isn't another video telling you to move more and sit less and leaving it there. You already know that. What you don't know is what sitting actually does inside your bloodstream, your spine, and your blood vessels, minute by minute, mechanism by mechanism, and why the fix isn't what most people think it is. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why a body built by millions of years of walking, squatting, and climbing reacts to a chair the way it does, and what specifically to do about it that isn't just stand up sometimes. Let's start with the actual design problem, because there is one, and it's more precise than people assume. Your body did not evolve in a world without rest. Hunter-gatherer populations that still live close to how humans lived for most of history. Groups like the Hadza in Tanzania, studied by researchers including David Raiklin and Herman Ponzer, actually sit for a similar number of hours a day as people in modern cities. That already breaks the story you've probably heard. The Hadza aren't constantly moving. So if sitting itself isn't the problem, something else has to be going on. And that something else is posture and muscle engagement, not the act of resting itself. Here's the part almost nobody explains correctly. When Hadza foragers rest, they mostly squat or kneel. Postures where the legs are still bent, but muscles like the calves, the quadriceps, and the postural stabilizers around the spine are still quietly firing to hold the body upright without a backrest. When you sit in a chair, those same muscles go almost completely silent. Researchers using electromyography, sensors that detect electrical activity in muscle, have shown that chair sitting produces dramatically lower muscle activity in the legs and lower back than squatting or standing rest. So the real design mismatch isn't you're resting too much, it's that a too much. It's that a chair removes the small, constant muscular work your body used to get even during rest. Now let's follow what happens once those leg muscles go quiet, because this is where the real chain reaction begins, and it starts with something most people have never heard of, an enzyme called lipoprotein lipase. Lipoprotein lipase, or LPL, sits on the walls of tiny blood vessels inside your muscle tissue, and its job is to grab fat molecules called triglycerides out of your bloodstream and pull them into the muscle to be used or stored properly. Research led by physiologist Mark Hamilton, largely working with animal models and some human studies in the Maidam Highlands, found something striking. When a muscle is inactive, not exercising, just still, luteal activity in that muscle can drop by a large margin, in some experiments as much as 90% in the muscles that are switched off. This research is strongest in animal studies, and the human evidence is a bit less precise, so let's be honest about that instead of overstating it. But the mechanism itself is well established. Muscles that aren't contracting stop pulling fat out of the blood efficiently. That fat doesn't disappear. It keeps circulating, and over time, more of it tends to get stored as fat tissue instead of being used as fuel. Here's the part that surprises people. This isn't about calories burned. You could sit still and burn roughly the same number of calories as someone doing light fidgeting and still end up processing fat completely differently. It's not a math problem of energy in versus energy out. It's a chemistry problem of whether the machinery for clearing fat from your blood is switched on or off. Hamilton's research group also looked at another blood marker while they were at it. HDL cholesterol, the kind often called good cholesterol because it helps clear other fats out of your bloodstream. Their work, along with related human studies, found that HDL levels tend to track with how much time muscles spend inactive. More inactivity, generally lower AGLE. Again, this is a modest, gradual shift, not something that happens dramatically in one sitting, so let's not oversell it. But it's another threat connecting the same root cause: quiet muscles processing blood fats less efficiently. Let's connect this to something you can actually feel the effects of: blood sugar. This is where the science gets very well documented, thanks to a body of research led by David Dunstan and colleagues at the Baker Heart and Diabetes Institute in Australia. In a well-known study published in Diabetes Care around Hangin Komchamihai, they had people sit continuously for several hours after a meal, then compared that to a group who broke up their sitting with short, 2-minute walking breaks every 20 minutes. The people who interrupted their sitting had meaningfully lower blood sugar and insulin spikes after eating than the people who sat still the whole time. Same meal. Same total sitting time, roughly. Completely different internal response. That's not a small, cosmetic difference. Insulin and glucose regulation are directly tied to long-term diabetes risk, and this study is one of the more replicated findings in this entire field. Why would 2 minutes of walking do that? Because muscle contraction pulls glucose out of the bloodstream through a pathway that doesn't even need much insulin to work. When your leg muscles contract, they can absorb blood sugar directly, almost like opening a side door instead of waiting for insulin to unlock the front one. Sit still, and that side door stays shut. Stand up and walk for even a short burst, and it swings open. This is the same reason some studies have found that just standing, without walking, produces a smaller effect than actually contracting the leg muscles through movement. Standing alone helps a little, but movement is what really opens that glucose pathway. There's an earlier study worth knowing too, because it shows this isn't a one-off finding. Genevieve Healy and colleagues published research in Diabetes Care back in Hainan Komchamletam looking at office workers wearing activity monitors and found that people who naturally took more frequent breaks from sitting, regardless of how much they exercised overall, tended to have smaller waist circumference and lower levels of C-reactive protein, a marker of low-grade inflammation in the body, compared to people with the same total sitting time taken in longer, uninterrupted blocks. So this pattern shows up not just in a controlled lab experiment with walking breaks, but in how real office workers naturally live their days. Now, here's a rehook worth pausing on. Most people assume the fix for this is exercise later. Go to the gym after work. Undo the day. But research on this specific mechanism, including work by Genevieve Healy and colleagues on breaking up sedentary time, suggests the damage from hours of continuous sitting isn't fully undone by a single workout afterward. The pattern of breaks throughout the day matters on its own, separately from whether you also exercise. That means someone who sits for 9 hours straight and then does an intense 1-hour workout is not biologically in the same position as someone who sits for 9 hours with regular short breaks, even if their total exercise minutes are identical. This is one of the more counterintuitive findings in the whole field, and it's exactly why it'll make up for it at the gym doesn't fully hold up. Let's move to a mechanism you can literally feel if you pay attention to your own body. Blood flow in your legs. When you sit for a long stretch, blood tends to pool in the veins of your lower legs because the muscle contractions that normally help pump blood back up toward your heart, sometimes called the muscle pump, aren't happening. Researchers including Jaume Padilla have studied what happens to the arteries themselves during prolonged sitting, using a measurement called flow-mediated dilation, which tests how well an artery can widen in response to increased blood flow, essentially a marker of how healthy and responsive your blood vessel lining is. Studies in the early Hainan Komchamus found that after just a few hours of uninterrupted sitting, flow-mediated dilation in the leg arteries measurably decreased. The vessels became less responsive, less flexible in that moment. The encouraging part of this same research, even brief walking breaks were shown to prevent or reverse that drop. This isn't a permanent injury from one afternoon of sitting. It's a temporary, reversible dip. But it's a real, physical, measurable one, not just a feeling of stiffness. That pooling effect isn't only uncomfortable. In extreme, prolonged cases, it has a name doctors actually use. Some clinicians call it economy class syndrome, after research including work by Susan Canagiator and colleagues linking long-haul flights of 4 hours or more, where passengers sit almost motionless, to a measurably higher risk of deep vein thrombosis, a blood clot forming in the deep veins of the leg. This is a real, if relatively rare, risk, and it's precisely why flight crews tell you to move your ankles and get up periodically on long flights. That advice isn't just comfort, it's targeting the exact muscle pump mechanism we just described. And if you want to see what total, extended inactivity does at the far end of the spectrum, space agencies and bed rest researchers have already run that experiment for us. Studies on astronauts and on healthy volunteers kept in strict bed rest for research purposes, including work associated with NASA and various bed rest laboratories, have found bone mineral density can decline at a rate of roughly 1% per month of near total immobility, concentrated especially in weight-bearing bones like the hip and spine. To be clear, this is an extreme case, total immobility, not a normal day of sitting at a desk. So let's not stretch it into sitting gives you osteoporosis, but it's a useful boundary marker. It shows that bone, just like muscle and blood vessels, is a tissue that adapts to how much load and movement it actually receives in either direction. So here's where we are so far. Quiet leg muscles shutting down fat-clearing enzymes, blood sugar spiking higher than it needs to, and blood vessels temporarily losing some flexibility, all from stillness, not from anything you're eating or any exercise you're skipping. But there's a structural mechanism too, and this one is about your spine, not your bloodstream. Back in 1996, a Swedish orthopedic researcher named Alf Nachemsen ran an experiment that's still cited today. He placed pressure sensors directly inside human intervertebral discs, the cushions between the bones of your spine, and measured the pressure in different positions: standing, sitting upright, sitting slouched, lying down. What he found reshaped how we think about sitting. Pressure on the lower spinal discs was measurably higher in sitting than in standing, and higher still when sitting in a slouched or reclined forward posture without support. Lying down produced the lowest pressure of all. This is why sitting for long periods, especially with poor lower back support, is so strongly linked to lower back discomfort. It's not that sitting is inherently evil for your spine. It's that the geometry of most sitting positions increases the physical load on structures that are built to handle load intermittently, not constantly, for hours. One detail from that same body of research is worth knowing because it's directly usable. Nachemsen and later researchers found that reclining the backrest slightly to somewhere around 100 to 110 degrees, combined with a supportive lumbar cushion pressed into the small of the back, measurably lowered disc pressure compared to sitting bolt upright with no support. It's not a cure for the hours of stillness itself, but it's a small, specific, evidence-based adjustment to how you sit, not just how long. Here's a rehook, because this next part is the one almost nobody mentions when they talk about posture. When your hip flexors, the muscles at the front of your hip connecting your thigh to your spine, stay shortened for hours because you're sitting with your knees bent, your nervous system starts to treat that shortened length as the new normal. Meanwhile, your glute muscles, the big muscles in your backside that are supposed to power hip extension when you walk or stand, sit in a lengthened, under-rused position for the same hours. There's a concept in movement science called reciprocal inhibition. When one muscle group is chronically shortened and overactive, the opposing muscle group can become relatively inhibited, meaning your nervous system recruits it less efficiently. This is sometimes informally called gluteal amnesia by physiotherapists, though that's a description of a functional pattern, not a formal medical diagnosis. The practical result: after years of heavy sitting, some people genuinely have to relearn how to fire their glute muscles properly when they walk, because the muscle hasn't forgotten how to contract, but the neural pathway to recruit it quickly has gotten weaker from disuse. The anthropologist Daniel Lieberman, who studies how human bodies evolved relative to modern lifestyles, has pointed out something else worth knowing here. Populations that regularly rest in deep squats or on the floor rather than in chairs tend to move their hip and knee joints through a much larger range of motion many times a day, simply as part of sitting down and standing up. Chair use, by contrast, lets people sit down and stand up while barely bending the hip and knee past a shallow angle for years at a time. The joint itself isn't damaged by a chair, but the range of motion it's asked to produce shrinks, and joints that aren't regularly moved through their full range tend to become stiffer and less mobile over time, not because of age alone, but because of disuse, the same theme we keep circling back to. Let's zoom out for a moment, because there's a population-level piece of evidence that ties all of this together. A widely cited meta-analysis by Virat Biswas and colleagues, published in Annals of Internal Medicine in Hainan Kumcham, pooled data across dozens of studies and found that higher total sitting time was associated with increased risk of death from any cause, increased cardiovascular disease, and increased risk of type 1 diabetes. And importantly, this association remained even after adjusting for how much people exercised. That last part is the detail that matters. It doesn't mean exercise is useless. Regular physical activity clearly reduces these risks on its own. It means sitting time appears to carry some risk that isn't fully cancelled out by also being an exerciser. Two people can hit the same number of gym minutes per week, and the one who also sits for 12 additional hours a day still shows up in the data with somewhat higher risk than the one who moves lightly throughout the day. This is sometimes summarized as sitting is an independent risk factor, not instead of exercise mattering, but in addition to it. That same body of evidence extends beyond diabetes and heart disease. A review of the research led by Brigitte Lynch, published in Cancer Epidemiology, Biomarkers and Prevention around Hainan, looked at sitting time in relation to cancer risk and found associations with higher rates of colon cancer specifically, along with weaker associations for endometrial and lung cancer in some of the studies reviewed. The proposed mechanisms tie back to some of what we've already covered. Chronically elevated insulin, more circulating blood fats, and low-grade inflammation are all conditions that, over years, are linked to abnormal cell growth. This is association evidence, not proof of direct cause, and cancer has many contributing factors, so it would be dishonest to present this as a settled, one-to-one relationship. But it's a serious enough signal that several major cancer research bodies now list prolonged sitting as one of several modifiable risk factors worth addressing. Now here's a mechanism that explains part of why that might be true, and it comes from research by James Levine at the Mayo Clinic on something called NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. NEAT is the energy your body burns through everything that isn't formal exercise. Fidgeting, shifting your weight, standing up, walking to get water, even just maintaining tiny postural adjustments. Levin's research found that NEAT varies enormously between individuals. In some of his studies, differences in NEAT accounted for hundreds of calories a day between people of similar size, simply based on how much they naturally moved throughout normal daily life. A chair-heavy day doesn't just remove exercise time. It removes hundreds of small muscular events that used to add up across the day, each one small, but cumulatively significant. This is the same reason sitting doesn't have to mean doing nothing intends to still matter. The damage isn't from missing intensity, it's from missing frequency. There's one more consequence worth naming, because it's less obvious than a physical one: mood. Several reviews of the research, including work summarized by Megan Taichen and colleagues, have found associations between higher total sitting time and higher rates of depressive symptoms, independent of how much exercise people got. Nobody has fully nailed down the exact mechanism, and it's worth being careful here. This is correlational evidence, and people who feel low might also sit more as a result, not only the other way around, so the arrow of causation isn't fully settled. But some of the same biological threats we've already covered are plausible contributors. Chronic low-grade inflammation, disrupted blood sugar regulation, and reduced blood flow can all affect brain chemistry, not just physical health. So the fatigue and low mood that show up after a long day of sitting still might not be purely psychological. Some of it may be the downstream effect of the same mechanisms sitting in your bloodstream and your muscles. Let's bring in one more layer, because there's a common myth we should correct directly. The idea that a standing desk solves this problem completely. Standing still for 8 hours has its own issues. Some research on prolonged standing has linked it to increased strain on the lower back and leg veins, and a few studies have even found static standing doesn't meaningfully improve glucose metabolism compared to sitting, unless there's actual movement involved. The mechanism we walked through earlier makes this obvious in hindsight. It's muscle contraction that opens that glucose pathway and keeps the venous muscle pump working, not simply which position your skeleton is in. Standing still is not sitting still, but it's also not the same as moving. The variable that actually matters, across almost every mechanism we've covered, the enzyme, the blood sugar, the blood vessels, even to some extent the spine, is movement frequency, not posture category. So let's turn all of this into something specific you can actually use, each one tied directly to a mechanism we just covered, not generic wellness advice. First, break up sitting roughly every 20 to 30 minutes with even a brief burst of movement. Walking to another room, a short set of bodyweight squats, anything that contracts the large leg muscles for a minute or two. This directly targets the Dunstan research. It's not about total activity for the day. It's about the frequency of muscle contraction interrupting glucose and insulin spikes. A phone timer is a perfectly legitimate tool here. This isn't about willpower. It's about building a cue you don't have to remember on your own. Second, if you can, take a short walk specifically after meals, even 5 to 10 minutes. Given what we know about muscle contraction opening that glucose uptake pathway independent of insulin, a walk right after eating is doing something structurally different from a walk at a random point in the day. It's intercepting the exact window where blood sugar is rising fastest. Third, spend a minute or two, a few times a day, actively stretching your hip flexors and consciously contracting your glute muscles. Something as simple as a standing hip flexor stretch followed by a few glute bridges or squeezes. This directly addresses the reciprocal inhibition pattern we discussed. You're not just loosening a tight muscle, you're actively repracticing the neurosignal to the muscle that sitting tends to quiet down. Fourth, if your work allows it, alternate between sitting and standing rather than treating a standing desk as a permanent fix. And when you do stand, don't stand perfectly still. Shift your weight, walk in place, take a call while pacing. Given that static standing doesn't reproduce the glucose or vascular benefits of movement, the goal isn't to swap one static posture for another. It's to increase how often your position and muscle engagement actually change across the day. When you are sitting for a long stretch, set your chair back to a slight recline with real lumbar support, pressing into your lower back, rather than sitting bolt upright with nothing behind you. And separately, a few times a week, spend even 30 seconds actually sitting on the floor and standing back up, or coming down into a full squat and holding it briefly. Given what Lieberman's cross-cultural research points to, this isn't about flexibility for its own sake. It's about asking your hips and knees to move through the fuller range they were built for, instead of letting a chair quietly shrink that range down to almost nothing. None of these require a gym membership, an expensive chair, or an hour you don't have. They work because they're aimed precisely at the mechanisms we just walked through. The enzyme that clears fat, the pathway that clears sugar, the vessels that need periodic flow, and the muscles that need periodic reminders they still exist. So go back to that moment at the start. You, sitting exactly where you are, legs quiet, watching this. That stillness isn't dangerous in the dramatic way headlines make it sound, and it isn't harmless in the way we've been letting ourselves believe either. It's simply your body running the only programming it has ever had. Thousands of generations built around frequent, small movement, meeting a modern world that asks for hours of stillness in a single, unbroken block. Your body isn't broken by the chair. It's just still waiting, quietly, for you to remind it what it was built to do. And maybe the most useful thing you can take from all of this isn't sitting is bad. It's that your next small movement, the one you almost talked yourself out of because it felt too minor to matter, is doing more inside you, right now, than you were ever taught to notice.